Okay, so picking right back up, still in chapter one, we're going to start talking about the biological roots of physiological psychology and just how we kind of got to contemporary biopsychology today. So a lot of the roots of psychology start with philosophy, and so if you look at Hippocrates, for example, and this was in 460 to 370 BC. Hippocrates considered that the brain is the center of thought and emotions. And if you look at other cultures, especially during that time, there was a lot of argument that believed that the heart was the center of thoughts and emotions. And even Aristotle didn't agree with Hippocrates and believed that the brain cooled the passions of the heart. And so there was some debate about why this was. And then there were other philosophers that said that's impossible because why would you put the brain and the heart so far apart? It doesn't make sense. And so there's a lot of argument there. But now we know, of course, it doesn't work that way. And the brain is really important in the reason in the center of thoughts and emotions. But again, this is all about, sort of the learning process. So going back to, very ancient philosophy, and then moving more toward a little bit more modern philosophy, we have Rene Descartes. So Descartes is deemed the father of modern philosophy. He's a French philosopher, a mathematician. He wasn't a biologist, but he saw the body as a machine, as very mechanical. He was very big on understanding reflexes and actually named them, and said, these sort of automatic, these stereotype movements that are a direct result of a stimulus, things that you don't have control over, you just do, is what he named reflex. Also, was a big proponent of the idea of dualism, which is what we talked at the very beginning of this session, and believed that there was a link between the human mind and physical brain, and believed that the brain really stemmed specifically in the pineal body. So Descartes believed that the hollow structures that contain fluid, which we know now are ventricles, were under pressure and served as a joystick, and our soul or mind controlled the body through our pineal gland. So, of course, we know that the pineal gland is important for some things, but certainly uh, is not believed to be sort of the source. Now, Galvani was very important, had made a very important contribution to what would later be realized as electrical impulses. So, Galvani's discovery of electrical stimulation. So, basically, he stimulated a nerve in a frog's leg, which then made the leg contract. It contract the leg muscle contracted, and so this was huge for the knowledge of physiology of behavior and understanding electrical impulses and muscle contractions. Of course, at the time that that discovery was limited, and then further allowed other scientists to build upon that work. And you're going to notice this trend where it's like, oh, this really good idea is really interesting, sort of forward motion, and then people sort of will then build upon that to further what we know about that thing. So Mueller also was able to take information from what Galvani gathered and build upon that. So Mueller was a German physiologist, and was incredibly important in the development of experimental physiology. And so his most important contribution to the study of the physiology of behavior was his doctrine of specific nerve energies. So he observed that although all nerves carry the same basic message, which is an electrical impulse, we perceive the messages of different nerves in different ways. And so this is something that we have been able to understand now to be, for example, action potentials and neuronal firing. And so we'll talk much more about that later. But again, this is just this discovery and sort of series of theories allowed for us to understand what we know today. And so Mueller's conclusion that because all nerve fibers carry the same type of message, sensory information must be specified by that particular nerve fibers that are active. And again, allowing us to really understand eventually what the brain is doing in relation to the body. Now, so there are so many scientists that really helped pave the way of where we are in physiological psychology. So I'm missing several, okay? And I acknowledge this, but just for the sake of brevity, I'm trying to get through to the most influential, just to move the story forward. So if you're reading the book and you're saying, "Oh, you left out this person," or about the history of psychology, you're like, "You left out this person." I know that there were a lot of contributors. The problem is that there's a lot of contributors. Okay, so let's talk about Florence. So, Florence is a 19th century French physiologist, and he removed various parts of animals' brains and observed their behavior. And so, for example, if you take an animal and you take a scalpel and you remove a portion of the brain, you're going to see that the animal stops doing something. So, for example, if you sever part of the brainstem, they're going to stop breathing. If you sever another part of the brainstem, you're going to stop the heart from beating. And so what Florence did was essentially use a method, or a research method called experimental ablation, where you actually observe what the function of a behavior is in the brain, and you infer that by damaging the part of the brain and then seeing what the animal can't do. Can the animal move? Can the animal remember something? If you take out certain portions of the brain, what happens? And so Florence claimed to have discovered the regions of the brain that control heart rate, control breathing, purposeful movements, visual and auditory reflexes. And some people, and especially today, as we look at, is this ethical or not? We'll talk about ethical treatment of animals later. Many people say, well, that's extremely unethical to, take behavior to take an animal and just cut parts of its brain and see what it does. And yes, and that's definitely arguable. But I will say that we did end up learning a lot from these ablation techniques. But it's certainly arguable if this is an ethical treatment, just generally speaking. Now, so of course, understanding animal behavior and animal brains is one thing. Now, can we translate that to humans? Well, Broca basically extended Florence's ideas to humans. So he, of course, Broca did not go in and actually ablate areas. Okay, so Broca was a French surgeon who in 1861 performed an autopsy on the brain of a man who had a stroke. And that man, when he was alive, he had lost the ability to speak. And so Broca put together that this particular person had brain damage from the stroke in a particular area of the brain. And basically put the two together. He, in power of deduction, said, well, if since this particular area of the brain is damaged, then that must mean that the area in which we speak must be housed in this particular area. So Broca's observations led him to conclude that a portion of the cerebral cortex on the front part of the left side, which is where he discovered the damage, must perform functions that are necessary for speech. And we refer to this area as Broca's area, which is right here. So that particular individual in the autopsy demonstrated or presented with damage here. And so Broca's area is the area that we refer to that usually coincides with something called Broca's aphasia, which is usually the ability to understand speech, but not necessarily to produce it. So the person can understand what you're saying, but they can't produce the fluent words or fluent sentences. And so this isn't always a clean disorder. When you're dealing with people with brain damage, especially when it comes to stroke and things like that, you're not going to get a perfectly little, section of damage that only hits one structure or one area. There's so much overlap, and a lot of times damage can be widespread, or it can be, messy in a sense that it might, this person might have had damage right here, and portions of this area are still intact, and they don't have as much of an issue as somebody who might have damage like this, and then somebody might have damage over here too. And so that makes things a lot more difficult when people have damage sort of all over the place, because then you're going to see some overlap in areas, but not necessarily know exactly which one is distinctly different from either. So this is not a clean and easy technique. It's much more ethical, of course, than taking somebody and poking holes in their brain and then seeing what they do. That would be considered unethical. But this is a sort of power deduction that allows us to be able to understand what people do with what areas of the brain. So moving on to Helmholtz, von Helmholtz. So von Helmholtz was incredibly, incredibly influential in the field. So Galvani, if you remember, Galvani was important for using electricity to demonstrate that muscles contain the source of energy that powers their contractions. He used those frog legs, and when he basically gave an electrical impulse, they contracted. Other scientists continued similar work, taking it step and step further, and then Hermann von Helmholtz came along. So what von Helmholtz did was responsible for many, many things. So he developed the law of conservation of energy, developed the ophthalmoscope, and so that is, to look at the retina in the eye. So if you're ever an eye doctor, and get that really bright, light, and that little device that looks kind of like this right here, and then they use this portion right here to look into your eye. That's an ophthalmoscope, and that is looking directly into the back of your eye. Von Helmholtz also formulated the theory of color vision and blindness, had the first measurements of the speed of nerve conduction. Lots of really, really great contributions, scientific contributions to the field, and furthered our understanding of physiological psychology. Now, if you take sensation and perception with me, we go into a lot of these theories in super detail about color vision and about how this works in the brain. We'll touch on it a little bit here in this class, but that's the class we're really going to get into major ideas there. Darwin was extremely important for the formation of a school of thought called functionalism. So he was actually responsible for this idea of functionalism. So, Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. He formulated these principles of natural selection, evolution that really revolutionized biology and really paved the way for our understanding of natural selection and in physiological psychology as well. And so one thing that Darwin really influenced is this idea that all of an organism's characteristics have some sort of function. Okay, so what Darwin did is he sort of followed the tradition of Muller and von Helmholtz, and other biologists who continued to observe and classify, think about what they saw, and then were able to, make these really valuable conclusions. Darwin was doing that. He formulated these principles of natural selection, and really made us think about, why is it that we do these things? Okay, what is the function of that behavior? So if you say, well, what is the function of love, right? Why is it that humans tend to fall in love? Why do we tend to want to be close to our family? Why is it that we crave human affection? Well, if we didn't, then we wouldn't survive as well as we do. Why is sex pleasurable, right? One of the functions could simply be an evolutionary function. It sort of secures our place as a species in the world, and it allows us to continue doing the things that we do. So we know that a lot of the theories are that a lot of the behaviors that we do are because of survival. And that's what, makes us be able to survive. Just like if we think back to the mice making nests, right? So a mouse, um, if it's a low temperature and the mice aren't activated to make the nests, they're going to die. They're not going to be able to reproduce and continue on their species. They're going to die. So that function of nest making for being activated by temperature is to keep them warm. Same thing with the hormones activating the same nest, because if a mouse doesn't build a nest while they're pregnant, then they're not going to have a place for their mouse pups. So I mean, it's one of those things that putting in perspective, you say, oh, well, that makes sense in terms of function. And this is where functionalism as a structure, school of thought, was born. Now, another thing that we can talk about in terms of evolution, natural selection, is this idea of brain size. So we talk about two sort of main terms here: absolute size versus proportionality. So all mammals and even birds require some parental care for a period of time while the nervous system is developing. And so when we look at how mammals spend that time, we're going to talk a little bit about that in the next two slides, about this idea that parental care is important and how long that development happens and all that's very important. But when we start looking at the size comparisons, so we know, for example, that babies, they have real big heads and they have kind of big brains, but there's a big development that happens, in the first couple of years of life. But when we look at the size, right? So the human brain is actually very small compared to other animals. For example, elephants have really huge brains, whales have really huge brains. But when you look at it in proportion to the body, the human brain, for example, makes up 2.3% of the total body weight, whereas an elephant brain, although it's bigger than a human brain, it only makes up for 0.2% of its body weight. Whereas if you look at a shrew, for example, a shrew's brain is huge for its body, makes up 3.3% of its total weight. So it's not important to just look at absolute size. You take a brain of a whale and you go, my God, that thing is huge, right? But what you want to say is, what is the size in proportion to the size of the animal, right? A shrew is a small animal, but when you look at the brain in proportion to the size of a shrew, shrews are not very big. You go, wow, that's a big old brain for that tiny little animal. And so that's important. This idea of proportionality is a bit more important than absolute size, because, what is it in relation to the body? Other things that we can look at in terms of natural selection and evolution is, why do we need to have such a huge brain, right? So we just established in terms of proportionality that our brains make up 2.3% of our body weight. We have really big brains for our bodies. Why? Why do we need that? Well, we need things like color vision to be able to locate food. Again, when we look at sensation and perception and we start looking at the visual system, when you're able to see in color, that changes your food sources. Because if you look at a tree, and in the tree we have, different fruits, if they're all the same color as the leaves, then we're not going to be able to eat that thing because we can't see it. We can't distinguish it. But the more color we can see, the more food that opens up and the more predators we can then see. And that allows us to be able to expand our diet. Um, Upright posture, important for us to get out of trees and to get onto planes and to be able to travel into many more types of environments. Language, super important for us to be able to communicate, because now we can hunt together. Now we can communicate with one another. Now we can establish more complex behaviors because we can build a foundation and learn and communicate with one another and actually be able to learn from each other. Tool use in fire. So the discovery of fire, being able to control fire and being able to use tools and create tools, allows us, again, as a species, to be able to build on knowledge and to be able to do more with less. And to be able to travel and to be able to, example with fire, is to have light at night so we can keep predators away, we can heat our food so we don't get sick with raw meat. Lots of really, really interesting, important things for natural selection evolution to continue the species, all very reliant on a huge brain that allows us to be able to do all of these things. Now, let's finish this idea out with neoteny. So, this is when we talk about the maturation of the brain and how slow this is. And so, when you have a process of really slow maturation, so when you look at how long it takes for an adult brain to really achieve maturation, so what is a mature adult brain? We're talking about 25 years old. Okay. Um, that is a long process, okay? But it's really important for development of a really large brain is to allow for that process to be slow and to be deliberate. So when we look at a baby's brain, it's not large enough or complex enough to perform physical and intellectual abilities of an adult, right? It's got to continue to grow after the baby is born. And when we look at how big a baby's head is, right? The cranium versus how large a female human's hip structure is. That baby has to pass through that birth canal. And so our brains and our skulls can only be so big because then if it gets too big, then we can't survive we'll be selected out because then people would die during childbirth. So this is kind of before the idea of like cesarean sections, for example. So if you have a C-section, it doesn't matter how big that baby's head is, you can pull it out, through surgery. But as we, kind of develop, and if our brains continue getting bigger, the hips have to then um, evolve with that, or people will die because they die in childbirth and they can't pass the baby through. And then they're not able to continue on the species, right? So it's a very delicate balance. It's a very delicate balance in terms of having a large brain and head, but also having the physical structure to be able to birth that, right? And so when we look at what happens in the brain during development. Okay, so the prenatal period of cell division in the brain is really prolonged in humans. And what that means is that the brain is going to then weigh an average of about 350 grams and contain about 100 billion neurons. And then after birth, the brain is going to continue to grow, it's going to continue to form connections, and it's going to continue to develop. And so what we know now is that we don't produce a lot of new neurons past this point, especially into adulthood. The only place that we really see brand new neurons or neurogenesis happening is the hippocampus. And this is relatively new knowledge. In the past 5 or 10 years, we've really discovered this. We used to think that no neurons were formed after birth, but we know now that even in adult brains, the hippocampus, we do see formation of new neurons. And then at that process of connection strengthening, there's processes that kind of trim out as we start to get older, especially during like puberty, for example. We see other brain cells which support and protect neurons. They start to proliferate, and we start to see this process happening. So this is a really important part here, is just this idea that the brain needs time. A human brain needs time to mature properly, and it continues to develop and it continues to change, and connections continue happening throughout life. Even in old age, you're going to see people establishing new connections, as long as they continue to, make use their brain and read and do things. Not even necessarily read, just using their brain, and not sort of letting it. And it's that whole adage of like, if you don't use it, you lose it, is very true when it comes to the brain. The final two things I want to cover in this lecture are is talking about ethical issues, ethical treatment of animals, because we've talked so much about animals, and also so much of our knowledge of the brain and the human brain comes from animals, comes from experiments on animals. So we really need to talk about the ethical treatment of animals. And then the final thing I want to do is talk about careers in neuroscience, just very briefly. So when it comes to treating animals, so this is an ethical debate, right? So this is ethics. This is all about, what do you believe, your morals. Some people will say adamantly, zero reason to we should not experiment on animals, we should not use them at all. So we have sort of this, sort of side of the spectrum where they say no, right, all the way to an absolute yes, right, okay, like almost to the point where we don't even, care about the ethical treatment. So you have people on completely the ends of the spectrum here. And so, you've got the absolute no's and then the absolute yeses. And then you have a lot of people who kind of fall on different points of the spectrum, in the on the spectrum. So people might lean more toward I don't think it's really super ethical, but in some cases, I think it's important. For example, I might say, oh, this person doesn't believe you should test your makeup on animals, but if you have a life-saving drug, it's okay to test on animals because that could save lives. So, I mean, you have people that kind of fall on different ends. This person might say, oh, well, I think that they should test makeup on animals so that people don't get infections and don't get harmed. And, I mean, so it's a debate that we could spend all day on. But it's the debate aside of whether to use animals or not aside. The idea is that when you use animals for experimental methods, you must treat the animals humanely. There's no excuse for mistreating animals that are in our care. Okay. And in fact, the interesting thing is that the vast majority of laboratory animals are actually treated much more humanely, and even more humanely in some cases than pet ownership. Because in some cases, we can see that it actually causes more suffering among animals than scientific research, because when you look at the scope of the number of people who have pets and neglect them, it's a very, it's a much higher number. And in fact, about 50 times more dogs and cats are killed by humane societies each year because they've been abandoned by former pet owners than those that are used in scientific research. So when you look at the numbers, it's a pretty interesting sort of set of statistics. But when we talk about what is humane treatment, okay, so they have to have appropriate animal care. When you have a facility that uses animals, doesn't matter what kind, you can be talking about rats, you can talk about non-human primates, which in psychological research, very few labs use non-human primates these days. Um, you have a veterinarian who's basically on call, and they check the animals. There's a routine number of times they have to check them, and they check their cages and they check their environment. Usually the way that labs are set up is so that if you have a facility, animals coming in and coming out are coming out two different halls. They don't actually meet or merge. Anytime you can reduce or eliminate discomfort, so if you can give the animal any kind of aesthetic or something anesthetic that allows them to reduce the amount of pain that they're experiencing, we want to do that. If it's a case where that's going to interfere with the experimental result, of course, then you try to find as ethical of treatment as possible. And you always want to do things like prevent infection. So animals might have to receive antibiotics, just depends on, the situation. Every single experiment, and this is super important, every single experiment that's done on animals must be approved by an ethical board. So the ethical board for animals is called the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or the IACUC. The IACUC is responsible for reviewing any protocol and ensuring the safety of those animals. So they have to do what's called a risk-benefit ratio. So risk-benefit ratio is basically making sure that whatever risk is involved is less than the benefit. So the benefit has to outweigh the risk for that. So if you have a group of bunnies, let's say, and you're going to do this experimental treatment on the bunnies. It's going to cause them significant pain, but the outcome is curing cancer, let's just say. Then you might say, well, the benefit's certainly going to outweigh the risks to the animal. With humans, we have something called the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB. They do the same thing. Their first number one responsibility is making sure that humans are safe, they're kept safe. And so they want to be kept from harm. So their job is not to see, oh, is this a good experiment? Is, oh, are you going to harm people? That's the main thing. So understanding the benefits, okay? Is it a potential cure? Is there a medical, thing that we're going to learn more about? Are we going to be able to maybe develop more treatments from this or develop a cure? Are we able to understand more about what this disease or disorder does? We do have animal models for Alzheimer's disease. We have animal models for autism, for example. Lots of different animal models that we do try to what we call translate. It's called translational research, okay, translate the information from animal work to humans. So we see an animal that is demonstrating particular symptoms, and we try to translate that to what that means for humans. And there are some really great models that we have, especially when it comes to genetic disorders, that we try to use for. The furthering of knowledge of particular human disorders and diseases. So whether you fall, more on this end or this end of the debate doesn't necessarily matter in this case. What matters is you understand what these ethical issues are, and you understand the processes if animal research continues. The final thing I want to cover is just very basically some careers in neuroscience. And so we're going to talk about this idea of the physiological psychologist. So it's also referred to, there's a lot of different terms of what you can use. So this is a scientist who's going to study physiological behavior. They're going to perform physiological behavior experiments with laboratory animals. We also refer to this person as a behavioral neuroscientist. This is, basically an analogous term. This is something that you can use interchangeably. Um, whoops, neuroscientist. And so, can't spell. So, biological psychology, biopsychology, psychobiology, physiological psychology, behavioral neuroscience, all of these things really come down to the same thing. And so that behavioral neuroscientist is mostly interested in performing physiological behavioral experiments with animals. They're observing things in non-human animals, these behavioral phenomenon. Now, some do study humans, and they use non-invasive physiological research methods, and they're trying to understand the physiology of behavior. And so this is the role of the nervous system, how it interacts with the rest of the body. For example, the endocrine system, which secretes hormones, how does that impact the body? How does that control behavior? And so people who study humans can use lots of different methodologies that we are going to actually go into later. And again, if you ever take sensation and perception, we learn about those methods in animals and in humans. But if you have any questions about anything that we covered today, you know that you can email me, and we will pick up on the next chapter in class. And so I hope that you had a good time with this material.